I'm going to read Mark chapter 9, verses 14 to 29, reading from the ESV version. I'll be reading the left-hand column, and on the right hand, there are some notes. We'll discuss that later. Jesus heals a boy with an unclean spirit. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. I just want to pause here and just point out that the word they refers to Jesus, Peter, James, and John. And this incident happens just after the transfiguration on the mountain, where Peter, James, and John saw Jesus being transfigured and appearing alongside Moses and Elijah. And they were discussing his upcoming uh, crucifixion and glorification. And I continue. So, and when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. Now, the second them refers to the rest of the disciples, so not Peter, James, and John. Going on from verse 15. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And Jesus asked the scribes, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." So that's the main reading. I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. And I'm just going to point out some things. The parts that I have underlined in black. Verse 17, where it says, "It makes him mute." And verse 18, "It throws him down. He foams and grinds his teeth, becomes rigid." Verse 20, where it convulsed the boy and he rolled about. And then Jesus asked, "From how long has this been going on?" And the father said, "From childhood." All of these are very typical of an epilepsy seizure. So, because you can see it makes him mute, right? When the spirit comes on him, it makes him mute. So other times when there's no seizure, he's not mute. So he's pretty normal, except for the times when he has seizures. And we can look at this and look at three options here. It's either an unclean spirit, which is what the Bible is referring to as a sorry, it's an epilepsy which they are referring to as an unclean spirit, which gives rise to the seizures, or it's an unclean spirit taking advantage of the epilepsy and giving the seizures, or it's just no epilepsy and only the unclean spirit, which is giving the seizures. Now, one clue that this is probably a medical condition is that the father says it has been with him since childhood. So I think it's highly unlikely that an evil spirit would take control of a child. So it's more likely that it is an unclean spirit that's taking advantage of the epilepsy and causing the seizures, or it's just the epilepsy alone, which they are calling unclean spirit. But if you go to verse 25, Jesus actually rebukes the unclean spirit, and he says, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." So the Gospel of Mark actually records these words, but they are not recorded in the other two Gospels, Matthew and Luke. So I was interested in this because prior to my diagnosis, I had seizures, micro seizures, and it started about 2 years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic. They would occur for about a few seconds at the end of the day, every other day. So not frequently, it's just a few seconds once a day, maybe once every other day. And so at first, because of the pandemic and all the hospitals were on lockdown, I didn't check it out. But last year, that is 2021, I asked my doctor to do some tests. So they did some preliminary tests, but they couldn't find anything. And so they did a CT scan, and that's when they found the tumor. So I thank God for my seizures, because if if those seizures weren't there, I would not be aware that I had a tumor. And about 6 months ago, when the doctor diagnosed the tumor, they also gave me some medicine for the seizures. So I have not had any seizures for about 6 months. And epilepsy can be, the epileptic seizures can be treated with medicine, surgery, and also diet. But this, after my diagnosis, I became much more interested in this particular sentence, this verse, chapter 9, verse 24, where the father of the child cries out, "I believe, help my unbelief." So it's like he has belief in Jesus, but he also has some unbelief. And I think that pretty much describes most of us. We have a faith, but we have some doubts as well. So just to look here at what the father's faith entails. So the father brought the son to Jesus because he wanted a miracle. He wanted to cure his son. He was desperate, and he had some belief in Jesus, because otherwise he wouldn't bring the boy to Jesus, right? And the rest of the disciples couldn't heal the boy. So let's remember, Peter, James, and John were with Jesus at that time. So the rest of the disciples couldn't heal the boy. And so as a result of that, his faith may have been shaken, and unbelief may have crept in. So Jesus asks the father, how long has this been happening? And now Jesus doesn't need the medical information because he's God. So the purpose of Jesus asking this question from the Father is uh, to draw out the information from the Father to encourage his faith in Jesus. Because if Jesus asks him this question, then the Father will be thinking that, okay, Jesus is going to do something here. That's why he's asking this question. So it's encouraging to the faith of the Father. And you can see in verse 22 actually, he says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us. And here I put a quote from a Bible teacher named Bruce Gore. He's a Presbyterian teacher. And he says, true faith always comes in a transaction of mercy and never merit. And true faith never comes negotiating or bargaining. And faith realizes we deserve nothing from God. We are wretched sinners. We don't deserve anything good from God. And so we are throwing ourselves at the mercy of God. That's how true faith comes to us. And so Jesus then turns around the statement that the Father made, if you can do anything, by saying, no, if you can. That is, he tells the Father, if you can do something. So what is it? What is that? He says, all things are possible for the one who believes. And so Jesus is asking the question, do you believe? And so the response from the Father, I believe, help my unbelief, it sort of sounds contradictory, but it describes most of us, I believe, because none of us have a perfect faith. And here I am quoting from Romans chapter 12, verse 3, and it's actually on the left-hand side on the column right at the bottom. For by grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And so we can all have different measures of faith. And even the faith to believe is given by God. And the spiritual gifts that we use with our faith, even those are given by God. So we have absolutely nothing, no merit whatsoever in the faith that we have and the use of our spiritual gifts. And we all can affirm our faith in Jesus Christ, but each of us has different ways of facing up to challenges. We will have faith in God when we face certain challenges. Others will have some doubts, but all of us are growing in our faith slowly once we are saved, right? Because we put into practice our faith. We put our faith in Jesus and we ask him, Lord, please help me to overcome this. Please help me, Lord, in this situation. And when we see God acting in our lives in a miraculous way, in an amazing way, then our faith increases. So all of us are on a journey of faith that is increasing. And finally, when the disciples asked him, why could we not cast it out? Jesus answered, this cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. And Bible scholars say that it's not just prayer for a few moments, but actually a life of prayer. That is, we are always, always, always thinking about Jesus, meditating on him, making silent prayers to him in our lives, in our daily lives. And living according to His will, listening to the Holy Spirit's guidance in everything. So that is the kind of prayer that Jesus is referring to in verse 29. And so my takeaway points here is that we all have faith in God, and that faith is a gift from God. And we all will face different challenges in our lives, and we encounter those challenges once again by having put our faith in God and seeing God working in our lives in answer to our prayers that we put to Him by faith. And with that, I will end this. If anybody has anything to say at this point,